Welcome back to Investigate Joe Rogan. This will be the final episode, investigating episode 1255, aka Alex Jones Returns. Much like episode 1255 itself, this investigation will be sort of all over the place and cover a variety of topics. But first, I would like to talk about something that someone sent me on Twitter about drugs in modern warfare, which is something I talked about last episode. A man named Ian Ian Hamburger, I do not know how to pronounce your last name, but he sent me an article about how the U.S. military is experimenting with a drug called modafinil in an attempt to have pilots and soldiers that can stay up for unnaturally long periods of time. Because, especially for pilots, it would be very handy if they could just stay up for 3 days straight or whatever. And the article talks about how apparently this is the big frontier in human modifications as far as the military is concerned. Not super strength steroids or laser eyes or whatever. It's about trying to have people that can stay up for a really long time. And there's sort of a sleep arms race going on. It's a pretty interesting article. I posted it on the Investigate Joe Rogan Twitter if you want to read it. Now getting into the new things. Alex Jones says that Jimmy Savile would eat kids' pituitary glands for the adrenochrome. And he references an InfoWars video called Adrenochrome Ambrosia and How America Eats Its Young. There's no evidence that Jimmy Savile ate anyone's organs. I don't know where he's getting that from. But the video has some things which are at least partially true, although it is mostly nonsense. It talks about a company called Ambrosia Health, which is a real company. And for $8,000, they will put 1 liter of young blood in your veins. And for $12,000, they will do 2 liters. However, there is no evidence that this actually does anything at all. Putting the blood of a younger person into your body will not make you younger. It will not make you live longer. This is a complete snake oil scam company. So if the Illuminati or whoever is really using this, they're getting ripped off, sadly. It also says that EpiPen companies donated to the Clinton Foundation, and they sort of draw a conspiratorial connection there because epinephrine, when oxidated, gives you adrenochrome. And looking into this led me to a website called Arrowid. I'm not sure how you'd pronounce it. It sounds sort of Tolkien-esque. But it describes itself as an attempt to collect, catalog, and publish the wide variety of experiences people have with psychoactive plants and chemicals, as well as experiences with non-drug mystical experiences, drug testing, police interactions, meditation, etc. So basically this website is where this dude does every drug and then writes about his experience. And the adrenochrome one is he tried to get it from asthma medication because apparently asthma medication has epinephrine in it. So he tried to oxidize it to get adrenochrome. And first he said he tried to smoke it, and after that did nothing. He just drank it. He just drank this asthma medication. And he describes his experience as follows. About 20 minutes after drinking the solution, I felt a tightness in my stomach. Within 45 minutes, I was in the midst of the worst pain that I've ever felt. Pure torture. This feeling could not be described as nausea. I did, however, try smoking some, quote, anti-nausea medication, unquote, in order to calm my stomach, but to no avail. The pain felt like my stomach was completely gorged with pure hydrochloric acid, and my stomach lining was dissolving. So, I did not need to read this in order to know that you should not drink asthma medication. But, I feel like this guy's really doing the world a favor in putting this information out there. There are real studies about adrenochrome, and adrenochrome will not reverse the effects of aging. It will give you psychotic reactions, such as derealization. So you should not take adrenochrome, and you should not try to get it by drinking asthma medication. Now, one thing the video says that is true, the video is pretty hilarious, by the way. It has a great, very dramatic narrator and a bunch of clips from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which it uses as an actual source. But anyway, the real connection they make is that the Milan company, which makes the EpiPen, really did donate a lot to the Clinton Foundation. Now, does this prove that the Clintons take adrenochrome to stay young? I think, if anything, if they were doing that, shouldn't they be the ones giving money to the Milan company, to buy the adrenochrome? And then if they are doing this, it is not working because they both look terrible and very old. Bill Clinton looks like he's got a foot in the grave, if you've seen a recent picture of him at all. So if they are really doing this, they are throwing money away. It is not working out. And I'm sure this company just donated because they needed some political favor or legislation or whatever. I think pretty much this whole video is total nonsense. It's worth watching though. From here, they move on to talking about the Aztecs, since they were also into various psychedelic substances. And Rogan says something which he said in other episodes, and as he points out, he has a bit about, which is that the Aztecs would sacrifice the winning team of their ball game. And I thought this was true as well. Well, I thought they killed the losing team because of the movie The Road to El Dorado, of course. But it turns out that most historians do not think that this is what actually happened. It does seem like there were sacrifices at the games, but not the players. It was probably captives or just part of the event in general. The Aztecs were really into sacrifice. So it would be like a side thing at the game or just part of the event. And it is thought that this misconception comes from the Popol Vuh, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but it is an Aztec epic in which some gods cheat at the game to beat some humans who they then decapitate. And then some of the dead players' sons have a sick comeback game, the Run Back, where they beat the gods and then they kill the gods. What the game was probably actually used for was a proxy for warfare. There are sources from the time that describe the Aztecs as using it to settle disputes without having to get anyone stabbed, which is nice. I think settling things with a ball game is a lot better than stabbing each other, even if it might not be as good as debate, legislation, etc. So I think that's nice that they did that. During this part of the conversation about ancient Aztecs, Alex Jones says that they smoked penis blood, and they did not actually smoke it. What they would do is they would basically bleed onto a paper, and then they would burn the paper. This is still pretty weird, obviously, and this is not even in The Road to El Dorado. So I didn't know about this until this podcast. He also says that there's a drawing of a jumbo jet in some Mexican museum that the Aztecs or the Mayans made. And the medium of podcasting kind of fails me again here. But if you just imagine a very vaguely cross or X-shaped object, that's pretty much all it is. And then the ancient alien people come in and say, oh, it's a plane. They had the technology. It's not hugely convincing, to say the least. Later on, Alex Jones says that in the book of Revelation, there is a one-world government, and that there is something where you will not be able to buy or sell unless you get it. And the verses he's referencing are first Revelation 13, 7, and 8, which says of the beast. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. And then the verse about buying and selling is 16 through 18, which says, also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. This might sound pretty straightforward. There will basically be a one world government where this beast rules everything. And then if you don't have this mark, you don't get to trade stuff. However, that is not the only interpretation. There are interpretations besides the idea that this is describing some distant future apocalyptic event. Personally, I think that the preterist interpretation is by far the most compelling, and that is that 666 is a reference to Nero. The name Nero Caesar in the Hebrew numerology of gematria adds up to 666. And in some early manuscripts, the number of the beast is actually 616. But Nero Caesar, transliterated from Latin rather than Greek into Hebrew, adds up to 616 because it has like a one-letter difference. So that would explain that difference, and I think that's just even more evidence for this being a reference to Nero. Nero obviously did not actually rule the entire earth, but he did rule over the entire Christian world at the time, what would have essentially been the known world to the writer of Revelation. And with this interpretation, the mark of the beast would not be a mystical thing that would appear or whatever, and it would not be a microchip that gets put in your brain or iPhone or whatever. It would be a libellus or libellus, however you pronounce it, which was a document in the Roman Empire that let you trade things, and you couldn't trade without one. Now, what's seen as the biggest problem with this interpretation is that Revelation was probably written after Nero killed himself in 68 AD. Most people would agree it was written after that point. This interpretation still works even if it was written after Nero was dead, because what they could have been doing was calling the then current emperor Domitian a sort of second Nero, or like the second coming of Nero. Which would make sense because, like Nero, Domitian was widely despised by Christians because he would persecute them, and he increased taxes big time on Lydia, which is where the people Revelations was written to lived. So there will never be a definitive, non-debatable answer about the mark of the beast, but this is very convincing to me. I mean, the verse even says, "Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. So I think there is really strong reason to think that it is a reference to Nero and not a distant apocalyptic sort of event. And I mean, keep in mind, these events sort of were the apocalypse for the early Christian church. So I don't think these verses mean that in the future the UN will put a microchip in your brain. After this, they get into some space discussion. They once again come dangerously close to a full-on flat earth argument. And Eddie Bravo says that the Flat Earth Society is controlled opposition and is not a true flat earth community. And I'm not really knowledgeable enough about the inner workings of the flat earth community to have an educated opinion on this issue. However, I would like to just point out that on the frequently asked question page of the Flat Earth Society, the first question is, "Are you serious?" To which they answer yes. And the second question is, "Are you controlled opposition?" To which they answer no. Now, of course, if they really were controlled opposition, that's exactly what they would say, right? So again, I'm not making any judgment here. I just thought that was worth pointing out. Their space talk does continue, though. And Alex Jones says he never denied the moon landing and never said that there were slaves on Mars. And I talked about Alex Jones's very unique moon landing theory when I was investigating episode 911. And it is true that Alex Jones himself never said there were slaves on Mars. This comes from a guy named Robert David Steele, who Alex Jones interviewed on his show. And he's the one who made that claim. Robert David Steele certainly seems like a bit of a weirdo. His website describes him as the conceptualizer of integrated election reform and the integration of holistic analytics, true cost economics, and open source everything engineering, such that we can achieve a prosperous world at peace 10 to 20% of the cost of the failed Western economic model, burdened by banks and lawyers. It does not mention how he thinks there are slaves on Mars in his bio. But that is what he said in the interview with Alex Jones. And Alex Jones's response during the interview is pretty funny. He clearly does not agree that there are slaves on Mars, but he doesn't want to just outright disagree with his guest. Maybe he doesn't want to make it awkward and, kind of tense. So he just says, "Look, I know that 90% of the NASA missions are secret, and I've been told by high-level NASA engineers that you have no idea. There is so much stuff going on." So, no, Alex Jones did not say that there are slaves on Mars, but I thought his response was pretty funny. It's like when your friend says something like really crazy, but you don't really want to get into it, so you're just like, "Yeah, dude, maybe. I don't know." Alex Jones also says that flying in a plane at noon is the equivalent of getting 10 chest x-rays in terms of radiation, and that flying into space is like getting 1,000. Now, the plane thing is wrong. To quote the Center for Disease Control, you would be exposed to about 0.035 MSV of cosmic radiation if you were to fly within the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast. This amount of radiation is less than the amount of radiation we receive from one chest x-ray. So you don't really need to worry about radiation if you're on a plane. Now, if you're going to space, you do need to be worried, and this is something that NASA worries about. So they have all these rules and precautions and stuff. But if you're listening to this and there's a possibility of you going to space at some point, you're probably already aware of this. You probably know more than me, to be honest. Alex Jones, the science guy, also says that the sun and moon appear bigger on the horizon because you are seeing them through less dust. And this is not true. This is actually because of the so-called Ponzo illusion, which is basically where looking at something on a horizontal plane, your brain has different expectations than if it was above your head. It's kind of hard to explain. Again, podcasting is sort of failing me here, but if you just look up Ponzo illusion, you'll find all these little diagrams where lines that are actually the same length look like they're different sizes, and it's an illusion, like a seeing eye sort of thing. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I just thought this was worth bringing up. It's not as important as Nazis and Hindu magic and so on. They don't talk about Trump very much towards the end of the podcast in this section, but I found it interesting that Alex Jones describes Trump as an idiot savant who he disagrees with on a lot of things. He even says that he has started to hate Trump because he's become his identity. And I think most people who are sort of only casually aware of Alex Jones or only know him through media coverage of him definitely don't know about this. He's more of a nuanced character than people tend to give him credit for, I think. The only other Trump-related thing they bring up towards the end is Alex Jones saying that BuzzFeed doxed a pastry chef at a Trump hotel and got her fired. And this is an exaggeration of what really happened. Pastry chef Elizabeth Alfieri, who worked at Mar-a-Lago, did not get fired. However, the Daily Beast and other, sort of small-time Twitter liberal websites did go after her and write these pieces about how she was a conspiracy theorist. Because on her Instagram and stuff, she would always talk about QAnon and, sort of Trump-ish conspiracy theories like that. So they didn't really expose her because she was very open about how she was into all these conspiracies. And she didn't get fired or anything. It was just them, trying to make a story out of nothing, basically. Oh my gosh, a chef is like a conspiracy theorist. I can't believe it. Just like not really a news story. This episode also contains some brief 9/11 discussion. More 9/11 discussion, actually, than episode 9/11. Alex Jones says he reported, along with many other news stations, the day of 9/11, that Tower 7 was going to be brought down by controlled demolition before it actually happened. He says everyone was reporting that it was going to get demolitioned down before it fell. And I could not find anyone saying that it was going to be destroyed in a demolition before it happened. But there is, of course, the infamous video where BBC reporter Jane Standley is in front of a window and she is reporting that Tower 7 has collapsed when it is, in fact, still standing behind her. And she's not saying that it was demolished. She's just saying it collapsed. And years ago, the BBC actually responded to this conspiracy. And what they said was that they had incorrect information the day of. They said there was all this chaos, and the information they got was that it had collapsed. And so they reported it collapsed when it actually had yet to collapse. Now, obviously, 9/11 people are not going to believe this, and they'll just say that this is trying to cover up the conspiracy. However, while I will admit that it is somewhat suspicious sounding, the logic of the conspiracy and the motivation behind it just does not make sense to me. Why would the government, if they were really in on it and either causing or allowing 9/11 to happen, why would they tell the media in advance? It would just open up your conspiracy to potentially hundreds more people who could leak the information, and it would not gain you anything. The goal, of course, would be to have the media report on it, but that's exactly what they would do whether you gave them the information in advance or not. So I really don't see what the point of this would be. Even the guy who directed Loose Change, Dylan Avery, which is like the most famous 9/11 truther documentary. That documentary sort of started this by bringing up this footage and saying that people reported it in advance. But when the BBC years later asked him about this, they just straight up asked him, like, do you think we're part of the conspiracy? He said, of course not, that's ludicrous. Why would the BBC be part of it? So not even the guy who sort of started this thinks that they would be in on the conspiracy. And I just don't think it really makes sense. So while Alex Jones is wrong and there were not stations reporting that it was going to be demolished before it fell, the closest thing I could find to that is on 9/11, very soon after it fell, there was an interview with Brian Williams and Lieutenant David Restuccio of the New York Fire Department. And it is worth listening to this interview for his extremely New York-y voice, which just makes it sound funny even though it is an extremely serious situation. And what he said was that we had reports that the building was unstable and that eventually it would either come down on its own or it would be taken down. I would imagine it came down on its own. So people use this as evidence that it was demolished. But he's not saying that it was demolished. You could use this as evidence that the idea of intentionally demolishing it was discussed or floated around the day of, probably to stop it from falling in a worse direction or something. Or what I think is more likely personally is that what he's referring to when he says it would either come down on its own or would be taken down is it could get hit by another plane. You know, the day of, they didn't know that the attacks were over. For all they knew, there was another attack en route. So I think it's more likely that that's what he's talking about. But it is somewhat suspicious, of course. But I just don't see what the motivation would be. Towards the end of the podcast, Alex Jones brings up another interesting sort of meta conspiracy idea. He says that seeing conspiracies about himself, which he of course knows are false because he is himself, has caused him to doubt conspiracies in general. So Alex Jones is bombarded with conspiracies about himself, that he has controlled opposition, that he works for the CIA, that he's Bill Hicks. And he knows these aren't true because he is Alex Jones. He is the authority on Alex Jones. And this same idea can be seen in the documentary Behind the Curve, which is about the flat earth community. And first of all, this documentary is great. If you have not seen it, you should watch it because it's really funny. And it's not mean-spirited. It is not making fun of flat earthers, really. It's more examining them as a community, although it is undeniably funny at times. And basically in it, Patricia Steer, who is a popular flat earth personality, I guess you would say, on the internet, she has the same conclusion, basically. She talks about how she sees all these conspiracies about herself, that she's controlled opposition, that she's secretly a man, that she works for NASA, etc. And it made her realize that people can just come up with conspiracies for anything without any evidence. And you can see in her eyes, you can look into her eyes and see that she is right on the edge of having a big realization, but that she's just not quite there. It's really something. You gotta watch this documentary. One of the last few things I will get into is Alex Jones says that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that you should not have kids. And this is not exactly what she said. What she said during an Instagram live stream was that, quote, "There's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult. And it does lead young people to have a legitimate question. Is it okay to still have children?" And I guess I would agree that it is a legitimate question, but I would add that it is pretty silly to be putting that question to first world millennials. It's a bit like going to Iceland and demanding that they reduce their carbon emissions because they're destroying the environment. They're not the real problem, if you see what I'm saying. Alex Jones also talks a little bit about Margaret Sanger, who he says admitted to targeting black people with abortion. And Margaret Sanger gets brought up in modern political discussions because she is the one who opened the first birth control clinic in the US, which sort of evolved into Planned Parenthood. And Alex Jones is not the only one who likes to say that she was targeting black people somehow. And Margaret Sanger is a pretty weird case. She does not seem to have been a racist. She never really said anything racist, but she was very into eugenics. So much so that she thought you should need a government permit to have children. So she was a serious eugenics sort of person. However, she was actually opposed to abortion. She thought that birth control would eliminate the need for abortion, and that abortion could only be justified in instances where the mother's life was in danger. So most of what politicians and internet commentators say about her is just totally wrong. She would not even approve of the current Planned Parenthood at all. And this sort of happens a lot when you take people from 100 years ago and try and fit them into your modern ideology. They just don't really fit your conception of them. And then the last thing I'll talk about is the so-called big enchilada, Alex Jones's macro theory of everything, which is talked about in episode 911 as well. And from what I can tell, it is essentially this. The elites throughout history, beginning with ancient magicians like Merlin, who is real, and the Aztecs and things, down through the Nazis and the modern CIA and NASA, are using psychedelic drugs to communicate with interdimensional beings, who he calls aliens. And humans were created by some sort of alien, and the interdimensional beings that can be contacted are bad and are trying to trick humans into wasting their untapped potential, sort of like Gurren Lagann. And while there is a God who created this universe, God does not know where he came from, and like humans is in a sort of simulation. Obviously, there is no evidence for any of this, and I'm really not sure what to make of it. It is not some sort of casual conspiracy theory, like, oh, my grandma thinks that Hillary is gay. This is a full-on theology and metaphysical view of reality. It may be best explained by the revelation in this episode that Alex Jones had a significant head injury as a youth. He tells a story about how he was pile-drived into the cement as a teenager. And he says, quote, "I am brain damaged, there's no doubt." He also said that he's been choked out a couple 100 times. Rogan, despite being the one who first wondered if he had ever had a head injury, he's the one who asked the question. He sort of dodges the implications of this. And Eddie Bravo asks if he thinks that this caused all these conspiracies. And Rogan simply says that he thinks head injuries can make people brilliant speakers. He's really good at avoiding implications like that. And I really have no reason to doubt Alex Jones's story here about his brain damage and head injury, Because in history, there is this idea of the criteria of embarrassment, where if somebody records something that is actually detrimental to their cause, it's thought that that's probably true, because their motivation should actually be to lie about it. So if they recorded it, it's a good sign that's actually true. So obviously this does not make Alex Jones look good at all. In fact, it calls into question pretty much everything he says. So he would have every reason to lie and say that he never got brain damage. But here he is freely admitting. So I think it's probably true. I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I cannot look at Alex Jones and say whether or not he has brain damage. But I think that idea has a lot of explanatory power. There were a lot of great quotes in this last section of episode 1255, so I thought I would conclude with some of my favorites. In reference to how we know what flies see, Alex Jones says, "They've got computers hooked up to the damn bugs." Later he says, "I think mystery is what's key. This is all a big stage, and God wants to see some people dance." And I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm kinda retarded. I have now fully investigated both Alex Jones and Eddie Bravo episodes, 9/11 and now this one. And I'm kind of sad to be done. These are my favorite episodes of JRE ever. And I really hope that they come on again. But sadly, I think that's sort of looking less likely, as Rogan has on bigger and more famous guests. It's probably less likely that he'll have on Alex Jones again. I'll still investigate older episodes of JRE whenever there are not recent ones that look interesting. I had planned on investigating these pretty much from when I started this podcast, but I don't know what other old ones are worth looking into, either because I haven't listened to them or because I just don't really remember them. So if you have any ideas for older episodes that should be investigated, you can email me or message me on Twitter. Hopefully you learned something from this, from my Alex Jones investigations. I'm not sure what exactly. Maybe lots of things. Maybe lots of small things. But I hope that you learned something.